Hi Matt,
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
nice to see you. We're talking today about the potential overuse of therapy speak
Yeah.
in everyday relationships, romantic relationships, particularly. We've written a blog post for Psych today, which you led on, which really tries to sharpen our attention on the potential dangers of overuse of therapy speak in relationships and what that
Yeah.
does to a relationship. Talk to me about why we wanted to write this, what we're worried about, and how it might help people.
There's a lot of it around, isn't there? I think you see it a lot of the time. I mean, you and I see it in practice when we're working with our clients, but I just hear a lot of it as well. People calling one another narcissists and
Yeah.
talking about dating avoidance and everything in the relationship being toxic. And I suppose what we were trying to do is say sometimes that's true. And if you really are dating a narcissist, you probably ought to do something about that. Probably ought to run a mile, right? But
Yeah.
sometimes life's just a bit more ordinary than that. Your partner is inconsiderate. They're what we might call like a pain in the ass sometimes, or just thoughtless about how they act around you. And it's probably better just to name that and to say, I didn't really care for that. Could you do that differently? I'd prefer it if, I'd appreciate it if,
Mm.
rather than getting into that name calling and kind of sort of attaching labels to it.
Is what you see a kind of generational thing? It seems to me that it's partly a generational thing, that younger people generally feel a bit more au fait and confident with using terminology from mental health in a potentially helpful way. And even using it in things like the political sphere, talking about political candidates as being narcissistic or whatever. And
Yeah, I reckon. I reckon you're onto something. I mean, I definitely don't think it's kind of just people at that age group who are
yeah,
using it, but I think it might be it might be kind of familiarity with mental health. I mean, there's an upside to this, which I try and talk a
yeah.
little bit about in the article, I suppose, in that it probably illustrates that people are caring and thinking about mental health more than maybe when you and I were growing up, right? But it also does seem to be a bit overdone. I mean, I think with so many things, there's some hallowed middle ground, isn't there? So sure, look out for those things. And I mean, the last thing I'd advise anybody to do is stay in a toxic relationship or downplay that. But I mean, what we're saying in the article is be clear that it is a pattern, a pervasive pattern of unkind, manipulative behavior, rather than you may have forgotten to tell your partner that your parents were heading over that weekend. That's really different from manipulating somebody and deceiving them and making them feel like they're gaslit, to use the term of the moment.
What's though the danger of the occasional use of that kind of language? So if someone does feel a little bit like they're being manipulated, is it that problematic that they use words like, it feels like you're gaslighting me from time to time? Probably not, right?
No, I think it's
It's if your
problematic.
entire worldview and your entire feel for the relationship is bound up in that kind of thinking and that kind of language that it becomes more dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. I think the risk where there is one, I mean, I think occasional usage, right? I mean, you and I probably slip into
Yeah.
probably things to our, partners that we you would choose to say differently on reflection, or, given a opportunity to go over. But I guess one of the risks of doing that on a more routine basis is you're also positioning yourself like a long way from it, as if you're not part of it, as if the relationship isn't give and take, as if it's not a two-way street. You're the one labeling and you're looking out for offenses, and you're being affronted by behavior, and you're describing it in a way that sort of puts you in a one down position, or not as an equal, or rather than just like, hey, I didn't really appreciate that thing that happened the other day, like I just wanted to come back to something that you said when we were out together. Can we talk about it in a calm way, rather than you're always doing this, or this is just like you, with those
Mm.
character assassinations. I suppose sometimes those labels feel a bit all inclusive, bit categorical, rather than naming the behavior.
Okay, so let's maybe help people listening and watching this differentiate between those relationships that might be problematic and genuinely come into some of those terms that we're talking about, gaslighting or narcissism, and relationships where actually it's more about appreciating and living with differences, right? So
Yeah.
there's something very, very toxic about being in a relationship with someone genuinely with a personality disorder that someone like you and me might describe as a narcissistic personality disorder. That could
Yeah.
be incredibly difficult. And probably a relationship you want to consider getting out of if you're in a relationship with someone like that.
Yeah, right. I think that's what we're saying, aren't we? That those terms can have a kind of clinical use. I think there are people who exhibit those behaviors in the world. The definition of a narcissist is something like, somebody who has a pattern, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, feels superior to others who
And
lack.
let's be clear, like that, you don't find many of them, right? So
Find
people
people with a
using
tendency towards that, don't you? Who do some
yeah,
of these things. I mean, we've worked in environments, you and I, where some people are, full of their own importance, right? They're constantly boastful about what they do. Now, that's a tendency towards an aspect of narcissism, but we're probably not saying they were doing that every moment of the day, that they lack
yeah.
empathy, and that really is the one.
It,
And
it would be hard to succeed in that kind of environment if you were truly that narcissistic, right? If you
yeah,
had zero empathy for other people and were so overly grandiose, you'd be called out on it. Other people would despise it so much that you probably wouldn't get on.
yeah, and I think I don't mean to say this in a flippant way, but I think if that is the relationship you're in, like, and you genuinely are of that
Yeah,
view, I think we say in the article, like, run a mile, and like, why would you want to be in that kind of relationship? And you're not going to fix that by naming it and asking for something
right,
different.
right.
Somebody is occasionally unsympathetic to you because you've had a heck of a day at work and they just want to watch something on TV. That is worth talking about, isn't it? Hey, I wanted you to listen when I was telling you about my day, and the other person's got the right of reply. They were saying, well, I did want to listen, but I wanted to do that after we'd done this, or I
Mm.
wanted to speak first, or I just wanted to jump through the shower before, we got into it, or I've had a heck of a day as well. And then you're talking, you're having a conversation about, that kind of difference between you.
Okay. Some of the ways that we try and guide people through this instead of using, more clinical language, a couple of principles like don't sweat the small stuff, don't
Yeah.
take yourself too
Yeah.
seriously.
Yeah.
They feel connected. Like if you're not taking yourself too seriously, you're less likely to focus too much on tiny little imperfections, tiny little frustrations, the kind of usual stuff that you or I might hear from couples about, not picking up their dirty laundry or leaving the cap off the toothpaste, the sort of
Yeah.
surface stuff that couples tend to argue about or get annoyed with each other about.
Yeah.
Expand on that a little bit more. Like, what do we mean when we say don't take yourself too seriously in a relationship?
And I think an example would be lots of people who I see have read that book or come across that idea of love languages, right? And
Yeah.
it's useful up to a point, isn't it, that we show affection.
Is it? Is it? How is it useful?
I think it's useful in the sense that sometimes I think some people, rather than vocalize it or articulate the love that they're feeling, they'll do acts of service for the
Right.
others. And they
Yeah.
sort of show their affection in quite concrete, practical ways. Like they might take care of something for their partner, and their partner might not notice that, but it might have been done out of love and affection. And so that would be a sort of specific example. And others, like, in some relationships, there's one person who's much more touchy feely, much more tactile than the other one. And it doesn't necessarily mean the other one is feeling any less. It's just they don't tend to explain, they don't tend to express themselves in that way. So I mean, I share your skepticism for taking those things too far. And that was really the point I was going to segue to. You might have a preference for certain things, but it is not, taking that very seriously, taking yourself very seriously is not your God-given right. Coercing or trying to contort your partner into being something they're not is a really bad idea. Like you can accept love as touch, you can accept it as an act of service, or you can say, look, I really need to hear you say, like, you're impressed with me, or I did really well in that environment, or it's something like that. You can talk that one through, and you can have a difference of view. And I think that's what's often going on in a relationship, isn't it? We connect with people, we first fall in love with them, we become kind of enchanted with them because they are often doing things which are, the bit of that they're doing something really different from us.
Yeah.
They're kind of, they're the yin to our yang. There's somebody who has kind of skills and attributes that we don't have, and you notice that and you really like it about the other person, and that's a lovely thing. But it also then does mean there's the potential for not seeing eye to eye,
Yeah.
more medium long term. So I think it's just keeping an eye on that. We're different people, like we've got different preferences, so chill.
I think what you're saying is harder in practice than it sounds. Like
Yes.
some of those conversations of actually owning your own stuff and being able to say, I need you to do a little bit more of this for me because it's the way I feel good in a relationship. I think that is a
Yeah.
lot of couples don't have those kind of conversations in my
Oh,
experience.
I agree.
They
I completely.
that they probably know it about themselves and they tend to kind of breed a bit of resentment and wishful thinking around I want my partner to kind of guess what I need and provide it for me and kind of seethe with resentment if that doesn't get given. I think it's really hard to say I'm a little bit upset about this or I need more of this kind of thing from you. I think particularly for men it can feel quite emasculating, quite immature in a weird way to talk about your emotional physical needs in that way.
I agree. I agree completely. I think, in some ways, like on another day, I've described that as an elite skill.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about that before, haven't we? And you've said, well, is it an elite skill or is it just something that we've not habitually done over time? Like maybe learning a language in other European countries, they learn English from very young and they keep learning it consistently. And by the time they're teenagers and, in their early 20s, they can speak it really well. Whereas our ability to speak French, Italian, Swedish is zero, huh? So I think
Yeah.
it's something like that. I mean, I think starting from zero, it does feel a bit like an elite skill. It's something that's really, really difficult to do. First time you pick up anything, bit like, first time you're on a driving range trying to golf or something, it's like, wow, if you've not done that before, it's really, really hard to do. I play a bit of tennis and I see people playing tennis when tennis gets popular and they're terrible. The technique is terrible. I want to go and coach them, and it's a bit like that with relationships. I think we're not so good at that. I think there is more emphasis on that now with kids, little kids in school, and talk of emotional regulation. But I mean, definitely not when you or I were growing up. You just sort of you get into your first relationship unless you've been lucky seeing conflict resolution at home, seeing mums and dads asking for the things they want in a measured way, then I think that's why we make a heck of a mess of it. And I
Mm.
see couples who are really sophisticated, like doing really complicated jobs in the world, being well paid for doing that, but actually their ability in terms of relationship skills is really low, really basic, really elementary, really not, in keeping with, their professional abilities, for example. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. While you were talking, I was thinking about how difficult it is to strike the balance between having a decent amount of communication, but not talking endlessly about the relationship. That part of what the blog post is about is us saying to people, you don't need to sweat the small stuff. You don't need to combat every time you feel slightly affronted in the relationship. That sort of victim mentality of he's doing this to me again or she's doing this to me again, sometimes just holding back and taking a breath and taking a pause is the better thing to do. We specifically comment on that old adage of don't sleep on an argument, always address it, always talk. If you feel something, vocalize that feeling. Whereas we're saying, actually, a lot of the time in a relationship, if you're vocalizing every time your partner annoys you, you're going to be talking about the relationship all the time. And it's going to sap the kind of positive energy out of that relationship if you
I
do that.
agree with you, and I sort of disagree as well. I think there's a bit of middle there. So it's I think biting your tongue is a really good idea lots of the time. But I actually think if you step into these things early and when it's low, if you imagine a scale of 1 to 10,
Yeah.
you're hitting it when it's 1, 2, 3. This is what I tend to see in the work I do with couples, and I think about it in my own relationship. If you're hitting it early, you can just say it. You can literally say, "I kind of bugged me that thing that we, in that tone, quite lightly, being specific about it.
Yeah, but not too often, right? Not too
No, I
often.
mean,
If you're
but I
doing
think
that 5 times a day, you leave your partner feeling like they can't get anything right.
I think it can get dealt with really quickly, though. So I would say that's less about argument or talking a lot about the relationship. It's like this particular behavior on this particular occasion didn't really sit with me. It didn't kind of work for me. I didn't love it. In fact, I didn't really like it at all. I prefer this. And then the partner, if it's said like that in a factual way, I think can respond. They can say, well, maybe you're being a bit unreasonable, or I really didn't mean it like that, or I can see that from your point of view. But either of those, any of those alternatives can be dealt with quite quickly. And we're back to talking about whatever we'd prefer to talk about, state of the world or looking after the kids, or upcoming social events or whatever else it is. So I think conversely, the bit where I sort of somewhat would disagree, I guess, with your proposition that you shouldn't talk about it much, is that I think if you talk about it quite often, it gets much easier. You develop the skill, and it can be quite brief, it can be quite capped. I think what is awful and what goes wrong is when couples go out to dinner and they do a big old dissection or post-match analysis of an argument or the state of the relationship. That, I think, is fruitless. You'll get lost in it. You probably end up just rerunning the argument, in honesty.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Let's try and make it a little bit more practical as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
We've talked about not sweating the small stuff. We've talked about not taking yourself too seriously. There's a little bit about trying to connect through humor as well, almost
Yeah.
along the same thread of, instead of moving into that victim mentality and using clinical terms, to just try and together, I think we're advocating, try and laugh at yourselves as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, if your partner is a nuisance, disappointed, lets you down sometimes, maybe even embarrasses you sometimes in a public setting, well, I mean, welcome to the club. And also, do we seriously think we don't do that? Do you seriously think you're easy to live with, or a dream to live with, or your partner doesn't have things that they quite like to change about you, stories that you repeat, things you do that are, it's just, there's a bit of rough with the smooth there, isn't there? So a bit of lightheartedness about that, a bit of honesty and recognizing, that we ourselves can be annoying too, and that those things are not necessarily going to be a big problem. So I suppose what I think when couples talk about those small things that bug them is, it's a bit like you're going to the gym or you're doing some exercise. It's like, we're getting better at this. We're getting better and better and better. The reason I'd sort of go for those things early on when they annoy you or they come up and talk about them in a calm way is because I think, one, you'll eliminate them, you'll create a kind of virtuous circle, and two, it's sort of how the body works, isn't it? It's how bones get more dense and strong, it's how muscles become bigger. There is a bit of, like, you need to put a stress on them. So I think there just are disagreements in relationships, and I think sometimes couples freak out about that, and it's like, no, there are going to be disagreements, there really are. You're not going to get away from that. The question is, how do you deal with it? Can you deal with it in a factual way early on and just name the behavior, rather than get into the, I'm now feeling a resentment, this is now the third or fourth time you've done this, I've bit my tongue and now I've had it up to here.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
that's
then it comes out with too much force, doesn't it? It comes out as a thoroughgoing character assassination, or you always do this. What I hear
yeah,
is, I
absolutely.
never do that. And so that's unlikely to be true, and it's really not helpful. What needed to be said was, hey, you've done that thing again that we talked about that I really didn't like. And then if it's said in that way, I find often the other partner will say, yeah, it's fair, yeah, you have said that, I am trying,
And
sorry.
how important do you think it is that that is caught quite quickly? Because what we're trying to help people with, to some degree, is that moment when you're pissed off, that moment when you're annoyed, that has the potential to be a really dangerous moment, because you could move into that. You always do this, you always do that, character assassination. But it's also the moment where you've got enough emotional connection to what's going on, and your partner has just done it, that it might be the best time to have that conversation. Difficult to know which is which. I mean, part of that is about understanding yourself and understanding, like, am I so annoyed by this that I am going to lean in with the harsh, sarky comment that's slightly passive aggressive and designed to upset them,
Yeah.
or do I have that ability to stand back just that little bit to
It's always a judgment, isn't it? That, and I suppose that's the bit where it feels like an elite skill, because we're not so good at it and we're not so practiced at it. So I think in the example I was given, if one partner is saying to the other one, hey, that thing bugs me, and the other person might well say, oh, you, and always taking, they might not give you the response you want. And in that situation, if you're the partner bringing the thing, I'd step away from it. Like, it won't kill you to take an hour and then say, I felt a bit unfair that, the way you responded earlier. It won't kill you to sleep on it. It won't kill you to raise it the next day. If you keep getting rebuffed and you can't land any of the points that are important to you, you're not in the right relationship with the right person. But you can come back to it the following day. You can, like, give the person some space if maybe they've had a heck of a day, or they're tired, or they're grumpy, or you're trying to have a conversation and people are hungry and whatever else. Like, there might be some bad in pausing on that. I suppose the other point would be, like, we don't talk about this in the article, but it's that bit of research from the Gottmans, isn't it, who I think do some quite good work in this area, which is you've got to kind of put those deposits in the bank. So I think when you're asking for something, it is a withdrawal, and there's got to be something in the bank. Like, there's got to be money in the bank. So they're kind of 5-to-1 ratio. They're five compliments. Recognizing that somebody's done something kind for you, saying that they look nice today, saying that that color really suits them, thanking them for organizing something that they took off you. Still only at 3, aren't we? We've got to get to 5 before that I wouldn't take that count too literally, but you've
Yeah.
got to get something close to that ratio where I'm saying a bunch of nice things to you, and, oh, by the way, that thing, can we try and think about how we do that differently? If all I say to you is, can we do that differently, and I'd like this to be different, and I want that to be different, you're going to get the But if I've said a
Yeah.
bunch of meaningful things about how much I appreciate you and the relationship, and then I ask you to do one thing differently, I think you're like, yeah, sure, okay. Oh, and while we're on it, can you do something differently?
Yeah, so that kind of the fundamental mindset shift that I think is at the heart of what we're talking about is away from victim mentality that then leads to clinical terms like gaslighting, narcissism. It's all about me and what's being done to me, and more about, if you want compassion, be compassionate. If you want
Yeah,
something to be
exactly.
attentive towards you, focus on being attentive towards them. And then if you get nothing, then you're at liberty to kind of have a good question about whether you're with the right person who can
Yeah,
respond to you in
yeah,
an
yeah, yeah.
appropriate, kind way, or whether, more likely, in our experience, I think working with couples, it leads to a virtuous circle.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a really good point you're raising there, because we talk about that towards the end of the article, don't we? That maybe turn the lens on you and wonder how much you're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
How you are, how much you're doing in the kitchen, or how much you're doing with the kids. Could you do more? Could you be a more thoughtful and attentive partner? The answer is almost certainly yes. And you are then example in the kind of things you want. And I think it feels good as well. It's not really sacrificial, that, that I think will only enhance the relationship. So rather than being the relationship police, or being the one who's constantly evaluating your partner, is thinking about what you can do differently as well. And I think that does, one, make the thing more fun, and it's just a more sort of fair-minded way of going about it, isn't it? Your partner is not there to please you, serve you, do everything you want. Sometimes you've
Yeah.
got to focus on yourself, and wonder whether you're doing enough to appreciate the other person, rather than thinking about all the ways in which you feel underappreciated.
More broadly, one of the things we don't touch upon in the blog post that maybe we can finish with
Yeah.
is is the role of kind of the mental health field in some of this overuse of therapy speak in relationships, and how couples counselors, therapists, counselors can, in my experience, kind of often reinforce, and there's almost an incentive to reinforce, particularly if you're working with an individual, the idea that they are in a relationship with someone who is a bit of a narcissist, who is gaslighting them, because we're hearing one version of the client's relate or the patient's relationship, and it can be quite easy to fall into the mindset of, oh yeah, that person is a victim, that person is being manipulated in that kind of way. And I wonder if there's just a bit of a more general theme here for us in the industry, and just, if you're with friends, if you're with other loved ones that are using terminology like this, just to kind of hold it in mind that there's a bit of an overuse of these kind of more clinical terms in our culture, and we just need to be a bit careful that we've probably gone a bit too far in one direction, and we all need to play a bit of a part in shifting it back towards, now hang on a minute, you're in a relationship with another person with their own differences and their own needs, and what's really going on there, and just being a little bit more questioning of the use of some of that language.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree. Yeah, yeah. I mean, not masses to add to that, really. But I often, when I'm with couples and somebody uses one of those terms, I don't know, they talk about attachment, or they talk about their partner or somebody else being avoidant. I want to know what they mean by that. I want to
Yeah.
know they mean the same thing I do when I hear those terms, and, like, to try and unpack it a bit, because I think often those terms, just whether they're right or wrong, mask more than they reveal. It's like, what do we mean? Have we got the same understanding of that? In any case, I think when we put the phrase in, like, sometimes bite your tongue, in the article, I was like, this is funny psychological advice to give, isn't it? Because I think what people think counseling, therapy, is about is talking about it. Get everything aired, get everything out there. Never, never bite your tongue. You'll be repressing an emotion. Heaven forbid we do such a thing. But sometimes you can hold that. You can wonder whether it's really important to you. So there's something sort of practical and common sensey about that. Like, we're not made of spun glass. You're not a broken bird. It will be okay if somebody upsets you or disappoints you. You'll need to raise that if it's happening again and again. You'll need to be able to say what it is you prefer, and check in with your partner as to whether you're doing anything like that to them. But you will be fine, unless, back to the start, you're with somebody who is who is a narcissist, who's genuinely out to gaslight you, as in make you question your sanity. In that case, same advice, run a mile. But if it's not that, get into it, talk about it. You'll be okay, and you get better and better and better at it as well. If it is a skill, it's sort of one of those things that needs to be practiced over and over.
That feels like a good place on which to wrap it up for today.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. All right. Thanks, Matt. See
Yeah,
you again
really nice
soon.
to see you. Take care.
All
Bye.
right. Take care. Bye.